Hey guys, I realized that we didn't get very far in class today, and we really don't have time to get that far behind. So I'm going to go ahead and make a video. It's going to be really short with the basics for the notes for the homework, and then at the end of the video, I'll kind of adjust the homework and tell you the specific problems that'll be due on Friday. So we already did the idea of solving by taking the square root of both sides, and so now what I'm going to introduce is a concept called completing the square. So basically, I want to solve this equation, and the other day we talked about solving this by factoring, but there's another method. I want to solve by completing the square. And what that means is I want to take what's here, and I want to turn it into looking like one of these examples that we just did. In other words, I want it to look like I have a quantity squared equal to something, because if it looks like that, then in order to solve, I can do what I did up here on A, where I just took the square root of both sides. Okay, so look at this box over here. In this box, it kind of gives us the steps on how to do that. So step 1 says isolate the x terms. Well, x squared minus 4x, those are the x terms, right? Isolate means get them by themselves. So I'm going to leave the x squared minus 4x on the left side, and I'm going to add 8 to the other side so that I have the 8 over there. Okay, now step 2 says to set up this kind of mess, but I know it's a little bit confusing looking, but what you need to think to yourself is basically I want to set up a quantity squared. So I'm going to set up a parenthesis squared, and then what's inside the parenthesis, well, it tells me right here exactly how to fill it in. The first term is always going to be x, or whatever your variable is. The plus or minus depends on what your original problem is. So right here I have a minus, so this is going to be a minus. And then this number right here, it says, is 1/2 b. Well, look right here. B is the number that's with the x. So the number that's with the x is a 4. So if I want half of that, that means I'm going to put a 2 in here. Okay? Now, here's the thing. By changing it into this quantity squared, I've actually kind of changed the value. Because if you think about it, now you don't need to write this step, just watch a minute. If you think about it, if I were to square this out, if I were to take x minus 2 times x minus 2, I would have x squared minus 4x plus 4. So basically, I've turned what used to be just x squared minus 4x into x squared minus 4x plus 4. So by writing it as this quantity squared, I've randomly added 4 to that side. Well, it's okay to add to one side as long as you also add to the other side. So basically, what's going on here is all of this is turned into the quantity squared, and then on the other side, we just have 12. So that's why what number 3 says here is after you set up your parenthesis, you take that 1/2 b number, which in our case was the 2 over here, and you square it. Well, 2 squared is 4, and then you add it to both sides. And notice I put in quotes both sides, because if I didn't add it right here, I really wouldn't have noticed. But I need to make sure that I add it to this side, because that's going to change the 8 into a 12. Now, I'm going to finish solving this, and I know because this is new, it could be a little confusing right now, but when we start going through the next examples, we'll just kind of go through, step 1, step 2, step 3, and I think it'll be easy to see what to do. So if I want to finish solving this equation, just like I did up in part A, wouldn't I want to take the square root of both sides? So if I take the square root of both sides, I'm going to have x minus 2 equals plus or minus, remember, square root of 12. Now, if I want to solve for x, yes, I'm going to have to add my 2, but let's do this. Remember how to simplify a square root? What if I think of that 12 as being like a 4 times 3? Because then isn't the square root of 4 just 2? So really I have 2 square root of 3 instead of square root of 12, right? And then, like I said, if I want to solve for x, I'm going to have to add that 2 to the other side. So my answer is going to be plus or minus 2 square root of 3 and then plus 2. Okay, so we got a lot going on here. I know it looks completely new and different. So let's kind of go through this step by step. All right, letter B. So first of all, number 1 says isolate the x terms. So I'm going to move that 13 to the other side. So I've got 4x squared plus 24x equals 13. Now, here's something that I don't have up here in the steps, so we're going to put kind of like a little asterisk, and that is you can never complete the square if you have a number in front of your x squared. So what I have to do is I have to get rid of this 4 before I can go on to the next steps. Well, if I want to get rid of the 4, couldn't I just divide all the way across by 4? So if I divide everything all the way across by 4, I'm going to have x squared plus 6x equals, and I know this doesn't come out evenly, but that's all right, just write 13 over 4. Okay, now that there's no number in front of the x term, I can start going through my steps. Okay, so I've already isolated the x's. Number 2 is to create your quantity squared. So what do I fill in? Well, I'm going to fill in x, because this is a plus sign, I'm going to put plus. And then how do I know what this number is? Well, it's always half of this number in front of the x. So half of 6 would be 3. Okay, so I'm going to leave out all of the extra explanation and go to step 3. Step 3 says you take that 1/2 b, so you take that 3, square it. So if I square that, I'm going to get 9. And notice it says to add to both sides. So it's kind of like I'm adding 9 here and I'm adding 9 here. But remember, the 9 on this side doesn't really affect anything on the right because it took all of that just to get that quantity squared. So what I have over here on the right is whatever 13/4 plus 9 is. So let's see. If I think of 9 as 36/4, then I think on this side, don't I actually have, what is that, 49/4? Right, if I have my 13/4 and my 36/4. Okay, so if I want to finish solving, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So on the left I have x plus 3. Hey, the square root of 49/4, well, if it's a fraction, just do the square root separately. So wouldn't it be plus or minus 7 over 2? Okay, and then if I want to solve for if I want to solve for x, don't I want to subtract that 3? So here's what I have. I've got x equals the positive or negative 7/2, and then I'm going to subtract 3. So let's think about our two possible answers. If this is a positive 7/2, let's see, isn't that 7/2 is 3.5? So if it's a positive 7/2 and I subtract 3, wouldn't it just give me a positive 1/2? But if it had been a negative 7/2, right, like I said, that's negative 3.5, and if I subtract 3, wouldn't that be negative 6.5? But we don't like to write it as mixed numbers, right? So if I wrote that as an improper fraction, wouldn't it be negative 13/2? So our answers are positive 1/2 and negative 13/2. Okay, let's try another one. So this time, I want to complete the square, but I need to start by isolating the x's. So I'm going to leave negative 3x squared plus 6x equals positive 1. And then remember, we don't want to complete the square with a number in front of the x squared. So if I want to get rid of that negative 3, I'm going to divide everything all the way across by negative 3. So I've got positive x squared minus 2x equals negative 1/3. Okay, so now I'm ready for step 2, I'm ready to complete the square. So I'm going to fill in x minus half of 2 is 1. And then remember that step 3 says you take this number, this 1/2 b number, take the 1, square it. So 1 squared is 1. And then, yes, we're adding it to both sides, but the only one I really care about is over here on the right side. So what do I end up on the right side? Well, negative 1/3 plus 1, wouldn't that be 2/3? Okay, so now if I want to solve it, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So I've got x minus 1 equals plus or minus square root of 2/3. And up here, it came out nice and neat to be 7/2. But if it doesn't come out nice and neat, no big deal, just leave it as a square root. So if I finish solving, in other words, if I add the 1 to the other side, I'm going to have plus or minus square root of 2/3, and then out at the end, plus 1. And like I said, if the square root doesn't simplify, no big deal, just leave it. Okay? So one last one. I know that these are different. You haven't seen them before, so that's why we're doing so many examples, okay? So look at letter D. Letter D. So I'm going to isolate the x's. So x squared minus 4x and move the 5 to the other side, so it's a negative 5. And then complete the square, so I'm going to fill in x minus 2, right? And then that final step was take the 2 and square it. So if I square it, I get a 4. So essentially, I'm adding 4 to both sides, but what I'm really working on is what do I end up with over on the right side? I end up with negative 1, okay? And so if I want to solve it, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So I'm going to say x minus 2 equals, what is the square root of negative 1? Remember, in the past, we've always said, hey, we don't do the square root of negative numbers, right? And so what we would say at this point is no real solutions. Now, it's really important on these that you say no real solutions, because in a day or so, we're going to talk about, well, if it's not a real solution, then what kind of solution do you have? So for now, we're just going to say no real solution. Okay? So that's completing the squares. So that's new for you. All right, we're going to go on and do one more part, and this part is not new for you, so we're going to kind of cruise right through it. And that is, there's another way to solve these quadratics. So we could complete the square, or we could use the quadratic formula. Now, if we were actually in class, I would kind of go through this. This is kind of a setup for the quadratic formula, but I won't worry about it. Let's just go straight to the formula. You should have seen this in Algebra 1. Quadratic formula is this. If you have your equations set up like this, where it's equal to 0, remember a, b, and c are just numbers, then we would say x equals the opposite of b, so negative whatever the b number is, plus or minus square root, this is a big old square root, b squared minus 4 times the a number times the c number, and then all of it is over 2a. So essentially it just comes down to identifying a, b, and c. All right, so take a look at letter A. Well, it's not in the right form, right? I have to have it set equal to 0, so I'm going to think of it as x squared minus 2x minus 1 equals 0. So if I write it like that, that means... So now I just have to identify the a, b, and c. So remember, the a is the number in front of the x squared, and if there's not a number there, it's assumed to be a 1. So the b is the number in front of the x, so it's negative 2. And then the c is the number over here, the constant at the end, so the c is negative 1. So now I'm just going to fill into that formula that's up there. So I'm going to say x equals, so negative b, so the opposite of negative 2 would be positive 2, plus or minus the square root of, b squared would be 4, minus 4 times a is 1 times c is negative 1, and then everything is over 2a, so 2 times 1 is 2. So now it's just a matter of simplifying. So I'm going to say 2 plus or minus. So under my square root, over here, because of this minus and this other minus, that's going to turn into a plus, right? So basically I have 4 plus 4, so the square root of 8 all over 2. And then simplify that square root, right? So I'm going to say 2 plus or minus. If you think of that 8 as being 4 times 2, then the square root of 4 is 2. Couldn't you bring a 2 out and then still have a 2 underneath? I'm hoping you remember simplifying your square roots from Mr. Cunningham. If you don't remember, I'm going to tell on you. And then that's all over 2. Right? And actually, in this case, we can go one step further, right? Because on the top, couldn't we factor out a 2? If I factor out a 2 from the top, I'm going to have 1 plus or minus. If you take that 2 out, you still have square root of 2, right? All over 2. And the reason I mentioned that is because now those 2's out in front will cancel, so your final answer is just this. Okay, so hopefully you kind of remember the idea of using the quadratic formula. So for your homework, if you look at the homework page, so from section 4.2, now you guys should be able to try this section right here where it says solve by completing the square. So that's the first thing I showed you, you know, the idea of turning it into a quantity squared equals whatever. So try 1 through 10 on those. And then on the quadratic equation ones, at the very least, so I want you to try all of this 1 through 6, where you're using the quadratic formula. At the very least, even if you can't get it simplified, at least set up that formula, you know, that x equals negative b plus or minus, you know, kind of stuff. So at the very least, get everything filled in. If you're having questions with simplifying, then maybe we can talk about that a little bit more. But for homework, for Friday, I want you to have tried all of this part. Now, it's going to be kind of hard to adjust that in Net Classroom and explain what I'm talking about. So you've watched the video, so you know exactly what to do. So good luck with that, and I'll see you all Friday.